Okay, awesome. Good night, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I hear there's a lot of people here. I'm so glad I don't know and I can't see you. But thanks for joining us in a conversation on the document formerly known as the Guidebook for Great Communities. My name is Ximena Gonzalez, and I'll be moderating tonight's town hall with Ward 9 Councillor Gian-Carlo Carra and the city's coordinator of the Guidebook, Lisa Kahn. But before we dive in, I would like to begin by acknowledging we are on Treaty 7 land, the traditional territories of the Blackfoot nations, including Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai, as well as the Tsuut'ina Nation and Stoney Nakoda First Nations. The city of Calgary is also homeland to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Please welcome our panelists, Lisa Kahn and Quinn Eastwick, both of the city of Calgary, and Councillor Gian-Carlo Carra, who will be sharing some updates on the guide, next steps, and more importantly, address the concerns of many Calgarians. To begin, I'd like to have our panelists introduce themselves. Lisa, can you tell us a little bit more about what you do and also share with the audience what your vision for the future of Calgary's communities is?
Yeah, absolutely. So hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Kahn. I'm the coordinator for the Guidebook team. I get to work with a fabulous team of individuals at the City of Calgary to create planning policy. Over my 15-year span at the city, I've worked in a number of different areas, including Center City Policy, the Land Use Bylaw, and my love with the Guidebook. My vision for the future of Calgary, I think one of the blessings that I've had is to work with a number of wonderful people, and really learn about the diversity and equity that's needed in this city. So my goal for a vision is one where all Calgarians feel included and feel like they have an equal voice.
Nice, thanks, Lisa. How about you?
So my name is Quinn Eastlick. I'm with the city's public engagement team, or the Engage Resource Unit, as we like to call ourselves. I've been working with the Guidebook team since about August of last year, helping them with some of their more recent engagement efforts. And man, after Lisa's extremely eloquent answer in terms of what I want to see in my community, my first reaction was like an excellent coffee shop on every corner. But I mean, I've lived in Calgary nearly all my life, and it's a city that I've enjoyed seeing grow in its diversity and its culture and sort of like the breadth of experience that I'm able to encounter here. And it's something that I'm just excited to. It's a process I'm excited to see continue.
Awesome, thanks, Quinn. How about you, Councillor?
I'm good. Thank you for agreeing to grill us tonight with the questions that you've curated from all the amazing responses from everybody who's attending tonight. My name is Gian-Carlo Carra. I'm the City Councillor for Ward 9. Like Quinn and Lisa, I was a planner. I was an urban design professional. I had a 10-year career. And now I'm in recovery. I'm 10 years into becoming a politician. So I'm not sure that's actually recovery. I think that's actually worse down the sliding scale into, hell or wherever it is you slide into.
Join us.
But to be very frank, I became a city councillor 10 years ago based on a 10-year career in sustainable urban design. And professionally, I got to practice all over North America and really see cities across North America and help cities across North America that were starting to recognize they couldn't keep on building a city of the automobile. They had to get back to the basics of building a city for people and a city really of neighborhoods. And not only did I get to practice across North America, but on my spare time and out of the largesse of my office, which was Calgary based, I was given a lot of leeway to do academic research and to do community activism in the communities of East Calgary. And so East Calgary really became sort of a living laboratory for me in the community activism front. I was the president of the Inglewood Community Association for 7 years. I worked extensively on the International Avenue Design Initiative, conceptualizing what is now the redux of International Avenue and the addition of high quality Max Purple Transit down the center of that beautifully rebuilt avenue. All of this through deep community engagement. And so 10 years ago, I came to the realization that our city wasn't really embracing the change that I was seeing other cities in North America do. And some of it had to do with the fact that we were doing better than a lot of places, and we didn't have that crisis precipitating change. But I saw where things were going. We were starting to talk through our municipal development plan about growing up rather than sprawling outwards constantly, but we weren't really changing the nuts and bolts of how we planned communities, how we planned with communities for change. And I went to City Hall on a platform called Great Neighborhoods, based on the idea that great neighborhoods make a great city. We have to plan for that. We have to engage the communities in that. We have to align what the city does with that. We have to be thoughtful about why we're doing that, i.e. it makes way more dollars and cents, environmental sense, social sense. And we have to really sort of be part of this international movement of the city rising at this point in history as the habitat for the project of human civilization on our planet. So great neighborhoods make a great city was the slogan. And for the last 10 years, I've been working with and fighting with the city departments. I've been working with and fighting with local community groups about neighborhood change. And we've slowly evolved through major projects like the Green Line, sort of forcing us to be thoughtful about change, and the 10-year review of our municipal development plan to really bridge the say-do gap and really operationalize the kind of city we want to build in planning policy that's connected to a transformed planning system. And the guide for local area planning sits at the heart of that. And I'm super excited to talk about it tonight.
Okay, thanks so much, Councillor. And well, I guess it's my turn to introduce myself. I'm a writer and editor based here in Calgary, and I write a monthly column in The Sprawl, where I explore the experiences of Calgarians living in our city and the opportunities we have to build a better city for all. And in my last column, I actually wrote about the guidebook, a little bit of an overview, what it is, because I wasn't entirely sure what it was supposed to be, and what it meant for what is my vision of Calgary, which is a city that is accessible to everyone and where you don't really need to drive a car to get everywhere. So that's what I wrote about in that story. But shortly, Lisa will give you a little bit of a more nuanced overview of what the guidebook is, the updates, and what we are looking forward now. I would like to thank everyone who submitted their questions, like all very good questions and fair enough, because yeah, a lot of those things, if I had not interviewed the people from the city, I would not have known, to be honest. So I'm glad you're asking questions. And so we're going to do a little bit of a discussion for an hour, and then we're going to move on to a Q&A session. So if you have any burning questions, feel free to pop them in your feed, and they will make their way to me and we can ask them at the end of the discussion. And well, as some of you might know, there were some changes released last Friday, including a name change. So, and the changes, the amendments are going to go to the Planning and Urban Development Committee on Wednesday, the 5th. So Lisa has prepared a little bit of a presentation about that. So go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you. If I can just get the PowerPoint up, that would be great. Awesome. Thank you. All right. So thank you, everybody, for coming. I really do appreciate you guys all taking the time to come learn more about the Guide for Local Area Planning, which was formerly known as the Guidebook for Great Communities. Tonight, I'm going to go over why it's important and its role and purpose in the suite of policy documents that guide development in Calgary. And then I'll provide a brief summary about what happened at the public hearing of Council on March 22nd and our next steps. Next slide, please. So first, I want to go over why it's important to plan for growth and evolution. Next slide, please. Growth and redevelopment are going to happen with or without the guide. Calgary and its communities will continue to change. The guidebook modernizes our approach to redevelopment so we can be strategic in that change. The photos shown here show the transformation of the Beltline from 1960 to 2019, and they reveal the level of rapid transformation that comes with this growth. We need to be thoughtful about how we want to grow and evolve as a city, and we need to plan for it rather than having growth happen without that plan. Next slide, please. Our population is increasing, and we're seeing significant changes in the makeup of people who live here. One of these major shifts is moving from a predominantly nuclear family type household with around 4 people living in one home to a range of household combinations with an average of about 2 people living in the house. One-person households have significantly increased from 7.5% in 1950 to 24% today. And in addition, more couples are not having children for a variety of reasons. So nearly half of our population, or about 47%, is made up of households with 2 or less people. Couples with children only make up 30% of all households in Calgary. And we really need to think about how these changing demographics impact the way our city grows and the type of housing that everybody needs now and in the future. Next slide, please. So today I want to talk a little bit about what led us to this moment, about how we got here. We're aware that the tools we had for city building weren't really working together. They weren't aligned. Our problem was that we had a planning system that wasn't sufficiently enabling citizens, community, or business outcomes. It wasn't simple or understandable or easy to work with, and it often relied on outdated regulation and policy. And we weren't seeing that connection on the ground. We weren't getting to the vision we planned for. The guide is the start of solving that problem and overall ensuring that we're advancing towards the successful implementation of our municipal development plan. Next slide, please. So now I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail about the guide. Next slide, please. Great places in our communities matter to Calgarians because they affect our quality of life, whether it's the type and affordability of homes, job opportunities, schools within our communities, as well as access to healthcare, services, amenities, and public transportation. It's about how safe and inclusive and supportive a place feels and our attachment to that place. To maintain the places for Calgarians to enjoy today, we must continue to plan for their inevitable evolution. Readying our communities for that evolution happens through a consistent and comprehensive planning approach that helps to support all Calgarians. It starts through our local area plan process, where we work with citizens and numerous stakeholders to discover what makes each of our communities great, what works and what we can build on through a process that brings us together to create a common vision for growth and evolution and change. Next slide, please. Now, the importance of the guide centers on a few key themes. The success of our city relies on ensuring our communities are welcome and attractive places, where we appeal to our youth to stay in Calgary, providing the right amenities for our aging and mature population, and attracting new talent and investment that will support Calgary's economy and economic recovery. It's also important to have more housing options within communities to allow for people of all ages, backgrounds, and abilities to stay and grow in their community. When communities offer more options for choice for homes and transportation and amenities, they're inclusive and provide social equity for all Calgarians. This means communities become more affordable, connected, and enable environmental responsibility. In addition, working with communities on where growth makes the most sense helps to attract that public and private investment, including improvements to our streets, parks, and public realm areas. In this way, more investment creates more reasons to stay and more communities, which support schools and community services. Next slide, please. The policies are not new that are in this guide. They build off of the citywide goals of the Municipal Development Plan, adopted over 10 years ago and recently updated with approval from Council. The guide is an implementation policy document that bridges the gap between the Municipal Development Plan and the local area plans. It provides a land use framework and a set of common policies that are used through the local area planning process. This improved alignment ensures that we can do local area plans in a more timely fashion, where we can improve consistency and clarity clarity of the interpretation of policies, we can reduce red tape and provide a clear vision for where growth and change will happen within our communities through the local area planning process. Next slide, please. The policies in the guidebook build upon the municipal development plan and are based on these principles. Calgary's communities are all great, and we want you to know we know that too. These goals ensure that as growth and evolution happen, they continue to remain vibrant, attractive, and prosperous for all Calgarians. Next slide, please. The guide works with our local area plans, and they must be read together. It also provides the toolkit for urban form categories that is used to map the growth plan. It also has common development standards, policies to guide the desired outcomes. This allows the local area plan to focus on local specific policies to guide development based on the local context and circumstances. Finally, the guide has several tools that a local area plan can use to enable conservation of heritage assets, support growth in transit station areas, and other opportunities for funding tools and investment strategies. Next slide, please. The local area planning process uses this framework for the urban growth plan called urban form categories. These categories are consistently used across local area plans and will direct built form in a community through careful consideration of where growth should and shouldn't occur. Next slide, please. The local area plan then creates maps using these urban form categories and building scales as defined in the guide. This ensures consistent interpretation of these categories across local area plans rather than each local area plan having to define their own categories. Next slide, please. The guide also provides a single location for implementation level policy to guide development across all communities. The document contains policy on built form, additional design considerations, and mobility. The policies contained in this section of the document establish expected development and built form outcomes that are used to assess planning applications. This section of the document reflects policies already approved by Council in many area redevelopment plans over the last 10 to 15 years. Policies were mined from these documents that reflect citywide development standards that are applicable throughout Calgary's communities today. Next slide, please. Finally, I'm just about to highlight what occurred at the public hearing of Council in March. Next slide, please. The 3-day public hearing of Council was the culmination of 5 years of public engagement to help build the guidebook, the guide for local area planning. More than 130 citizens provided their feedback at the hearing, with even more submitting letters. 5 major themes were heard on both sides of support for the guide. They're outlined here on the screen. Next slide, please. Council directed administration to report back and develop a what we heard based on the public hearing from citizens, stakeholders, along with additional engagement with citizens as needed. In April, administration hosted 7 workshops with citizens, community associations, and industry to validate administration's understanding of the feedback from the public hearing and to inform amendments to the guide. Later tonight, on April 29th, administration reported back to Calgarians in an online forum to advise them of the proposed amendments. Several amendments are being proposed to Council on May 5th that will address many of the concerns noted by citizens at the public hearing. These are all on our website at calgary.ca/guidebook. In addition, Council recommended that we consider whether the guide was approved as a non-statutory document as opposed to a statutory policy. Next slide, please. This week, we'll be returning to the Planning and Urban Development Committee, as Ximena mentioned, to recommend that the previous bylaw for our statutory approval be abandoned and instead adopt by resolution a non-statutory guide. In addition, administration will be asking to have the proposed amendments approved and to return with any future amendments through each local area plan. Next slide, please. The proposed amendments are a result of what we heard and our engagement with Calgarians in April. They're summarized into 5 categories with proposed amendments included. We are proposing to approve the guide as non-statutory. We want to provide more clarity on the guide's role. We're proposing to address several issues important to the local area planning process, such as tree canopies, historic block patterns, inclusive housing forms, and the consideration for vehicle-oriented uses. Additional policy will also be provided around protecting heritage resources and introducing the ability to identify various housing forms within a local area plan. I know 62 amendments seems a bit daunting, but many of them are textual amendments provided for clarity. We definitely heard it's something that folks were looking for in the document. Next slide, please. Finally, we're planning a robust sustainment plan should the document be approved. At the request of all of our stakeholders, we'll be pursuing a sustainment committee to ensure regular connections with all of our stakeholders and to identify issues as they arise. Engagement going forward will also focus on the issues and trends, the implementation of the guide, as well as updates to the guide that will occur through the local area planning process. Next slide, please. So that's the end of the presentation. I just wanted to say a big thank you for having us here and for this discussion. I'm really looking forward to it. So I'll pass it back to you, Ximena.
Thanks, Lisa. This was really, really good. I think let's start from the beginning. What is a local area plan and how is it different from an area redevelopment plan?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So an area redevelopment plan is defined by our Municipal Government Act and is a plan for an area that's already seen its maybe first life cycle or so. It's already developed and it's already kind of going through that second life cycle. For the city, we call these area redevelopment plans a local area plan because we want to make sure that it's about the local specific context and want to be able to provide some of those parameters around it. So a local area plan is an area redevelopment plan. We just call it something slightly different.
I'm going to jump in and sort of pick a little bit of a bone with that, and I would say that you know, area redevelopment plans, as Lisa said, exist in the Municipal Government Act, and so does area structure plans. And area structure plans were sort of how we grew our city over the last 7 decades. We would take a farmer's field and we would apply an area structure plan to it. We put a bunch of cul-de-sacs on a former farmer's field, and people would move into, you know, largely single-use communities. More and more, our greenfield growth has gotten more mixed use, but it's really been about, it's been a development regime that's been based on the idea that once you put a plan in place, the neighborhood doesn't change. And oftentimes it can't change because it was designed by counting cars. And once you put in a bunch of streets that are a certain width and you have one way in and one way out, like places like Royal Oak, and you have a certain number of cul-de-sacs, you cannot stuff any more people in or out by car and without the whole place failing.
Mm-hmm. And how will the local area plan help address this very
well? So I mean, just to tell you, the area redevelopment plan was for many years an attempt to make the existing established city function like the suburbs. And so oftentimes they were sort of exercises in trying to prevent or tone down the growth and change that was possible. And I think there's been a significant shift in thinking about our communities, and mixed use urban neighborhoods are not like those suburban communities, and they're designed to change over time. And so I think there's been a real trend saying, well, we need to drive change and we need to drive the change that makes sense. And so the shift from an area redevelopment plan to a local area plan is really a shift in thinking from a planning regime that used to prevent change to a planning regime that drives change, and that drives change through very thoughtful community conversations. And so I'm going to throw that out there and say that we are changing how we do things in a pretty fundamental way, and a new name is appropriate.
Yeah, and change is very scary for a lot of people, as we've learned, including myself. So what are some of the say assurances you're giving people, like what kind of change is going to happen next door to me or to anyone? Like how is this local area plan going to protect homeowners' interests? How do we make sure that the community's character doesn't change, that heritage is protected? How does the local area plan do that?
Yeah, there's a lot of things in that question there. So one of the things I want to say is that change doesn't happen overnight. We have had communities with zoning or land use designations that offer way more potential than what's actually on the ground right now, but you don't see them being redeveloped because people still want the house that they bought and to see that through in their community. So I want to be very clear, change doesn't happen overnight. But you bring up a really good point about, you know, how do we provide that assurity to folks? And I think one of those one of those ways is through that local area planning process. So through that process, all of the stakeholders will be brought together to have that discussion about where growth does happen, what it can look like, and maybe where it doesn't happen or where it's not appropriate in the community. And I think through that discussion, we can also start to talk about investments into the community, both public and private investments, and how we make sure that growth is successful when it does happen, so that we're not just all of a sudden putting ad hoc density somewhere. It's really about looking at how do we need to make these communities grow in a way that's successful long term. We have some of the most forward-thinking heritage policies we've ever had in this city in the guidebook, and I'm really hopeful that we get to move forward with a number of them over the next couple of years.
Yeah.
GC?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that you said, Lisa. And I mean, something I always tell my constituents, and I've told them for the last 20 years that I've been involved in community change and city building, is that the only thing that's guaranteed is that your community's changing. And you can do one of three things. You can sit back, relax, and see what happens. You can engage in the fool's errand of trying to prevent change, which is going to create maybe different change than was going to happen, but or you can sit down with everyone who needs to be around the table and have very thoughtful conversations about where have we come from, where are we at, and where do we want to go. And so it's not only a question, this is not just about a guide for changing your community, it's a guide for how we have the best conversations and have the best tools to apply to the situation. The other thing Lisa said that is totally true is that change comes from a variety of different vectors. It comes from demographic change. It comes from investment, both public and private. And this is about getting everyone working together. And when I say everyone, I always say that, it's the people who live in a community, it's the businesses that operate there, it's the institutional actors like the schools and the churches and the temples and the gurdwaras and the not-for-profit sector. Everyone needs to be around the table and have a very thoughtful conversation. And the job of the city really should be to curate, to facilitate those conversations, and then to put bold plans in place that protect the things that we love and that drive the changes that we need. And we're getting there with this guide.
Yes. One thing that kind of seemed to happen at the council hearing was that these people felt like they had not been engaged early on, that they had not had a seat at the table. So what happened?
Yeah, maybe I can take a first stab at that. We've engaged a number of Calgarians over the past 5 years, and more strategically over the past 2.5 to 3 years about this specific guidebook. And sorry, I keep calling it the guidebook. It's the guide for local area planning. This will settle in my head before the end of the night. One of the things we tried to do with our engagement plan was really reach a diversity of individuals. So not the typical folks that would maybe have the time to come out to some of our open houses, and not in a standard way where we, rent a hall and have some boards and stand beside them to answer questions. We wanted to make sure that we went out and had conversations with people when they're going along their journey in their daily commutes and their daily lives. So we really learned a lot that way. And I think part of what's really important is to get out of the mindset of the typical person who cares about planning, because as we've seen over the past month, tons of people care about planning. But I really think it's about talking to them at the point where things are actually happening, because talking about planning can often have a result of creating fear where fear shouldn't exist. And, change is hard, especially when communities aren't going through a change. And so it's hard to relate to all the questions and the discussion that we have. So it's really been a labor of love. We continue to learn a lot about how we engage and what we engage on. But I do want to thank all the Calgarians that have come out over the past, 3 years to really talk to us about what they need in their communities and how they see Calgary growing.
I'm going to jump in with 3 points. And point number one is that the former guidebook, does not change your community. It provides you a suite of tools that could be applied and will be applied to a conversation about changing your community when you undertake the local area planning. And so I think one of the things that drove a lot of people out was the idea that their neighborhood was going to change because of this guidebook. And that's not true.
Yeah.
The guidebook actually represents a best practice, as Lisa described in her overview, of decisions that we made as a city through extensive engagement when we established our municipal development plan, 11 years ago, which for the first time ever said we can't keep sprawling out, we have to start growing up. And then through local area planning exercises that were very disjointed throughout. And I mean, the reality is it takes us a long time to do a local area plan. And every time we did one, we had to basically write an entire standalone treatise on the state of urban design. And every time you do that, if you have to do that, it creates a lot of time and effort. And so the idea was, why don't we take all the best practices, everything we've learned, put them in one place. So when the time comes to do the local area planning and have the conversation, we've already got a guide and we don't have to write a new guide every time. And so that's number one. I think there was a fundamental misunderstanding about that. I think that a lot of the communities, a lot of the people we heard from are very afraid of change, and they're not interested in their neighborhood changing. And they saw this as an opportunity to fight change. And again, that's not going to happen. If the guidebook exists or if it doesn't exist, if the guide exists or if it doesn't exist, change is still coming. And the question is, how do we drive the change that makes the most sense? We got to talk about it. And it's great to have a guide. And then the third thing I'd note is that a lot of the people who came out who were afraid of change were representing neighborhoods that are fundamentally not going to change from the guide. I mean, we heard so much from people in like Elbow Park and stuff like that. And the reality is Elbow Park is not going to change. The land economics mean it's not going to change. It's a very stable place. It's got restrictive covenants. And it doesn't necessarily have to change like other places do. And the conversation I've had with people from places like Elbow Park is that Elbow Park is an example of a picturesque enclave where the wealthy decided that they wanted to leave the mixed-use neighborhood environment of the city, the main streets, the factories close by that people walk to work at, and they wanted to live in leafy, exclusive greenness surrounded by other wealthy people. And that is just the reality of Mount Royal, Elbow Park. The problem is when we started building the city of the automobile, we got it into our heads that mixed use, mixed income neighborhood that had defined the way we built this city, the way human civilizations have built themselves across human civilization, would no longer be the model, and that we would create leafy green enclaves for everybody. Elbow Park, but for middle class people. Elbow Park, but for poor people. And at the end of 70 years of doing this, we realized that there are economic challenges with that. There are social challenges with that. There's environmental challenges with that. The wealthy can live wherever they want, but the rest of us need to have the support structure of mixed use neighborhoods where live, work, play opportunities exist and dense social networks exist. And the reality is the people who want their neighborhoods to remain exclusive are fighting us when they fight the guidebook, which is trying to make the mixed-use neighborhood the rule. They're saying, no, we want everyone to live by our exclusive rules. And that doesn't make sense. So I think it was a fundamental misunderstanding. And I'm just absolutely dedicated to getting it front and center in people's minds that the model has to be the mixed-use neighborhood, and the exception can be places like Elbow Park. And I think they would agree that they're exceptional.
I do want to say, too, sorry, Ximena, I just want to add on that because Gian-Carlo brings up a really good point about engagement with the guidebook, because, when we went through all these local area plans that we've done over the past 30, 40 years, it's like we had to recreate the wheel every time, and we had to recreate our engagement plan and figure out what we were doing. And I think the guidebook, one of the great parts about it is it'll standardize that way to make sure that we give everybody that common language so that they can understand the expectations and what that all looks like, regardless of which community you're in. So hopefully that helps with engagement moving forward as well.
One thing I find interesting, Councillor, that you just said that a community like Elbow Park is not going to change even if they have a new local area plan. So does that mean where wealthy people live, they have the leverage to make sure that their community remains the same, but a community like mine will change because we don't have a bunch of wealthy people who have a ton of time to go scream at city council.
Well, I mean, short answer, yes. More nuanced answer is that your question seems to imply that your neighborhood not changing is a good thing. And I actually disagree. I think that neighborhood change is a wonderful thing, especially if it's a change towards more diversified economies, more robust social structures and stuff like that. Anybody can choose not to, the wealthy have the ability to live wherever they want and do whatever they want. The rest of us need to live in a society that's mutually supportive. And we've built a planning structure and we built a city of enclaves that doesn't support that. And I very clearly, during the multi-day debate at council over the guidebook a couple weeks ago, I would take the occasional break and walk my little puppy out in the neighborhood, and I'd bump into all my neighbors who were walking their dogs, and they'd say to me, "What's this debate really about?" And I would say, and I live in Bridgeland, full disclosure, I'd say, the debate is that this neighborhood that we are living in right now and bumping into each other and talking in was an exceptional circumstance that required unbelievable pushing against a regulatory environment that we had created. And we need to make that the rule, not the exception. And that's really what this guide is trying to do. That's what planning's tried to do for the last 20 years or so, but we haven't operationalized it. And we're trying to get to the point where we operationalize it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How do you make sure that the change that's happening is good, right? Because since we're talking about my neighborhood, there is a lot of change happening in my neighborhood, but it's basically displacing Calgarians who aren't wealthy, because we have a $500,000 home being torn down and replaced by three $500,000 home. So that density is not really resulting into more affordable housing. So how is this new planning framework going to address that issue? Well, if it will, or what will?
For me, it's all about diversity and equity and making sure people have choice. So the guidebook isn't about creating, communities that allow for everything everywhere all the time, right? The guide recognizes that there are different types of communities, and those communities can still be explored and delved into through the local area plan process. What the guide does is really focus on that choice, so that whether you want to buy that $500,000 row house or the $800,000 single detached house or the $200,000 apartment, or whether you want to rent, or whether you want to drive your car or ride your bike, we want to create communities that offer that choice to everyone, so that when you go out and think, where do I want to live, you have those options. It isn't about saying everybody, must pay this much for a house in a community. It isn't about creating that. It is about making it more accessible, so that when folks do come to your community, they feel like they can be there, that they can live there, that they're a part of it, that they can see themselves in it. And one of the bigger things for me is about, people that maybe aren't like the four of us that are on the screen in front of you today, right? That have physical or even mental challenges. And how do we ensure that we're creating communities that work for them, that work for everyone? And right now, I think we've been in a really long history where Calgary has seen exponential success, exponential growth, and we've been keeping up with that. But a lot of that has had to do with, the type of demographics, like Gian-Carlo said before, and the type of socioeconomic patterns that we've seen in our community. And I think as we move into our next, decade, we're going to start seeing Calgary attract different and new businesses. And we need to think about what they need to attract that talent here, because like Gian-Carlo said, we want growth. Growth is imperative. We need to look at the benefits of growth. But we also need to do that in a way that provides for that growth to be successful, whether that's investment in infrastructure, whether it's looking at, things like water, sewer, or even transit and public realm amenities. It's really important that we look at all of that together instead of one-off decisions.
Yeah, totally.
I want to jump in and answer your question if I can, Ximena. because I agree with a lot of what Lisa has said, but I do want to talk about some things. And the first one is there is a very different thing. We're talking about building the city much differently and in a much more traditional way. And I've got to throw this statistic out here because Calgary is the exceptional example of the North American experience. 85% of everything we built on the face of the North American continent has been built since the end of the Second World War. So for the last 7 or so decades, we built most of what's on the ground, 85%. Calgary mirrors that statistic exactly. 85% of Calgary has been built since the end of the Second World War. That's the exponential growth that Lisa was talking about. But not only did we grow a lot more and faster than we had previously, we also grew differently. We built a city of the automobile that had where people live and usually segregated by income in one pod, and we had where they worked and shopped in other places, and where we built things and made things, industrial areas, and where people worked in different. And it was really about organizing how people got around in the car. Now, 15% of the built environment of North America, the inner city mixed use neighborhoods of tradition, are the places where people want to live. And I can tell you that there's more than 15% of the population that wants to live there than there is actual space there. And that's where the growth is coming in these inner city neighborhoods. Gentrification is really about supply and demand, right? Because there are more people who want to live in that 15% of mixed use environment than there are mixed use environments for them to live in. That's where the displacement occurs. And a great example, a great Calgary example is Garrison Woods. Garrison Woods was built, early 2000s, mid 2000s. It's actually the poster, it's the cover page of the municipal development plan, which came out in 2009. And the idea of the Canada Lands Corporation, who wanted to build an equitable mixed-use, mixed-income neighborhood using best practices at the time, was that they would have bigger units for wealthy people, and they would have medium-sized units for middle-class people, and they would have smaller units for people who were poorer, and that you would have rich and middle-class and poor all living in the same neighborhood. And when they built this beautiful neighborhood, so many people wanted to live there that you had wealthy people saying, look at that adorable little unit above that garage. We could sell our big unit, we could move in there, and we could get that place in Cabo.
Yeah.
And they priced everyone else out of the neighborhood. So
yeah,
supply.
Sorry. We need to keep going. We have a ton of questions.
Okay.
And I have one burning question that I really have to ask. And it's about the amendments. It sounds like now we're going to have like a special policy for single family housing. Like you're introducing a bunch of things that seem to be addressing the concerns voiced by the Calgarians at the hearing. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So me and my team went through all of the public hearing recordings over those 3 days and really tried to think of the themes and what was behind what Calgarians were saying at the public hearing. So through all of our engagement over April, we did a lot of sessions to look at that feedback, and we got about 190 pages of feedback just in April alone. And so my team and I kind of took that away to think about how much can we do and what can we do to really solve some of these issues, with single detached being one of the bigger ones that we had to think about and address. What we're proposing in the amendment is that Calgarians, for the most part, I think, really do understand the idea that growth and evolution are going to happen in communities. And they do understand that, we need that tool to have that discussion. But what they asked us for was also the discussion to balance that about where change might not happen. So I do feel like this new tool that we're adding is a special policy area to allow citizens to go in and delineate areas as single detached homes within their communities, to be able to say, here's where growth will happen, but maybe here's where growth doesn't need to happen right now. And I feel like having that tool really provides that balance to that discussion and just lends to a more fruitful local area plan process.
And will a community be able to be like, we're all good here, we don't need to add any multifamily buildings, thank you?
That's one of the joys of doing a multi-community plan process is not every community is going to be the same. And by grouping them together, we get to look at, your personal journeys and where you go. And I guarantee you, if you think about your daily journeys and what you do, you definitely go into those border communities that you share, right? Whether it's going grocery shopping, going to the doctor, going to your dentist, we all benefit from our neighboring communities. And so it's not that every single one community must have density or must have intensity. We need to think about it strategically. And that's what the local area plan process really does, is give us that venue to say, on this strip of a main street, that's where we want to put our intensity, that's where we want to put our commercial uses, and those places behind it, that's where we can say these are for single detached homes. So it's not about saying every community must have a certain percentage of each type of housing forms. Every community is going to be different, and it's totally feasible to think of a number of communities in Calgary where that intensification just probably isn't possible or warranted. But I guarantee you that those areas benefit from the density and the intensity that in nearby communities, and that's why we have to plan them together.
Lisa makes an amazing point. We were talking earlier about the difference between an ARP and a local area plan, an area redevelopment. That's the other big difference that we didn't get into, is that ARPs were one community and local area plans are multi-community. And the operational idea behind the municipal development plan is that every community has to become complete. And complete means mix of uses, mixed density, different opportunities for everyone. The other thing it means is that you're collecting enough property taxes to support the services that you're consuming. And ideally, you're creating enough value that your replacement costs of infrastructure on 50-year cycles is also supported by the tax base you're creating. You cannot expect every single community in the city, and actually majority of communities, to become complete over time. And so by creating a local multi-community area, the idea that those bunch of communities together can become complete over time is a much more realistic and a much more viable goal. And then you get different communities working together to create that completeness, and not every single one has to be all things to all people. And so I think that was one of the great ideas driving the guidebook and driving the local area planning process.
Yeah, good. Yeah. I'm glad we mentioned that it was multi-community, because that's key. Here's one question from a member of the audience who is wondering, like, there's a lot of misinformation as usual. So apparently there's this thing circulating that the May 5th is the last opportunity for people to have a voice in the development of their neighborhood, which obviously isn't true. Can you tell us a little bit more, Lisa, about how the engagement process is going to move forward?
Yeah. Absolutely. I do want to address the door knockers, or I think that's what they're called, the door hang things that were sent out today. Door hang things is my new technical term for this. There was a ton of information on just that small piece of paper. So that door knocker indicated that the guide would change density, height, setbacks, lot coverage. The guide does none of that. It doesn't change any of that on a parcel, and it doesn't change what can be developed today or the process for redevelopment that happens today. So all of that misinformation, I think, is really part of the reason why a lot of Calgarians have gotten engaged, because there's these kind of, over the top statements that make you think, oh my gosh, my community is going to change so much. When in reality, it's the engagement process through the local area plan that will talk about where change is going to happen. And even then, your land use and districts aren't changing. That is the process of the local area plan to kind of put on the ground where that's going to happen. But as we mentioned earlier, that process, takes over a year to complete, and is done in a very thoughtful way with residents, community associations, businesses, local support groups. One of the things we learned a lot through the guide's engagement process before March was working with a lot of our activist groups, right? So Healthy YYC and Active Living and our older adult support groups. They really helped us to think about how do we engage on that different level at that local area plan stage.
Yeah, thanks. And
Great answer from Lisa. I'll just add that the best practice in planning is to plan with communities, right? And the biggest thing about the guide is that we were sort of inside City Hall when I was first elected in 2010. There was a big debate going on in planning as to whether we would even do local area planning or every planning decision would be a one-off. And part of my mission was to say, no, we need to do local area planning. We need to get everyone together and engage citizens and drive the change with citizens that's already occurring in our neighborhoods rather than be victims of change. And so the biggest thing that the guidebook has done is it's consolidated city processes and it solved the debate as to whether we local area plan or not. The answer is we do so with community. And here's a guidebook to make sure that when we plan with community, everything we need to line up on the city side is lined up so we can do the best possible job. So it is extremely aggravating, when people who know better are out there spreading misinformation for political gain, that this is the end of your ability to have anything to do in your community. It's not. It's the first step in meaningfully empowering communities to pursue change. If your mission is to stop any and all change or to fight about every single thing, it makes a lot of sense that you want to fight the guidebook. But if your job is to really work with your neighbors to guide the best possible outcome for your community, this is how you get there.
Yeah. How can people, what are going to be like the ways for people to get engaged in the development of their local area plan? Like, how do they know who they reach out to? What are like the options for, say, people who are working all day, don't have time, that sort of thing?
So I'll bring attention to one of the attachments in our report. It's the local area plan sequencing. And so folks can look at that attachment to kind of find out where their area fits in the local area, in the evolution of when a local area plan will be coming to them. Once it does, we do put out the call for different levels of engagement. So we have like working groups that are very much entrenched in the development of the guide, in the development of the local area plan, that are responsible for taking information back to the bigger public at large. We often hold like open houses or workshops where the public can drop in, but we do want to make an effort to, do some of those things a bit differently and maybe think about how we engage on a different scale, whether those are like walking tours or, in these COVID times, kind of like aerial flybys or walking tours that you could do on your own. There's a number of things that we do to get people involved. I would like to see if Quinn, my counterpart, has anything to add. I just noticed he put on his camera, so I'm guessing he wants to jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to add too, with the local area planning engagement process, like both, I think from the public hearing as well as the engagement that we did following the public hearing in April, there was a lot of conversation about the fact that there was still a lot of room to grow in terms of how do we do that engagement and try to get communities as a whole active and engaged in that process and not rely just really heavily on CAs or really heavily on the working group. And I appreciate that. I think like the local area plans that we're going through so far have really been pilot processes, and we've really appreciated everybody's involvement in those as we've been going through them and trying to learn how to do this well and how to involve communities well. And so I just wanted to add that that conversation about how can we do this better and how can we get a broader base of the community interested and engaged in that process is something that's very much top of mind. That's all I wanted to add.
I have to jump in and just say I really appreciate the acknowledgement by our administration that we do have room to improve. And I'll just sort of tell you that, over the last 10 years, I started with the community, with administration really in a fight amongst themselves about whether local area planning is the way to plan a city. And I'm very happy that we've agreed that it is. Unfortunately, along the way, some of Ward 9 communities have sort of been almost guinea pigs and pilot projects in coming to how we do that. We have an ongoing process in Inglewood and Ramsey, in Bridgeland, in Ogden that were early attempts to get to where the guidebook is taking us. And there's a lot of frustrated people in those communities who went through earlier iterations that had successes and failures, and there's a lot of questions about how they sort of get back into the process. Some people, again, don't want to be part of the process. They don't want their neighborhood to change. They don't want to clarify things. They just want to fight whatever comes their way. But I think the overwhelming majority of citizens would be a lot happier to spend the time up front, so that when change comes, it's already moving in the direction we can all agree is a good way to go.
Totally, thank you. Here we have another question. This one is from Lorraine. She's asking why, she's asking about the ARPs and LIPs for communities like Ogden that are currently suspended. Like, what's going to happen to those?
That's sort of what I just answered, but Lisa will give you a bit more of the sort of the technical response.
Mm-hmm.
No, I think you were bang on with your point. So, we know that we have a lot to learn still, and those processes will continue, and we will continue to come to areas that need local area planning.
Mm-hmm. But what's going to happen with the plans that we're currently like, oh, this is going to happen, and they're suspended now? That my neighborhood actually is among them too. Like, are we going until the 5th, or until, what was it, the 22nd, when it actually, like, the guide is going to get approved? Or what's going to happen with LAPs in progress?
I hope it's not the 22nd, because that's a Saturday, and I really don't want to have to come into.
Yeah, I don't remember what day it is.
That's okay. The truth is, we're leaving it up to PUD to decide as to when they want to send it forward. So that decision is still yet to be made. Regardless of that, though, it should be in the next little while, right? And I think those planning processes are on hold until then. But then once we do have that approved guide, we'll definitely be going back into those processes and looking to see if all the engagement that was done prior is still getting us to that outcome, and then having those discussions about updates with that community as well.
Yeah, to reiterate, Inglewood Ramsey had an ARP that was being driven by the guidebook, and it was early days, and the city wasn't engaging well, and the community wasn't ready. We didn't have the guidebook to help guide the conversations, and so they're sort of stuck in this limbo. Same with Ogden, same with Bridgeland, and the idea is once the guide gets passed, and if it gets passed, then we'll be able to wrap everybody in, and those standalone ARP process, which were earlier attempts, will get wended into the larger local area planning process.
Mm-hmm. I think Quinn had some things to say here.
Sorry, I had to get myself unmuted. And
Yes.
Lisa, to correct Gian-Carlo earlier, Engage Planner, which is my title, is a fancy way of saying that I do public engagement. I have a background in communications, which is like, as it pertains to planning as a discipline, very closer to basket weaving than anything. So, but Lisa, correct me if I'm wrong though, in terms of like the plans that are like for areas that are to be covered by a new local area plan, until that new local area plan is in place, whatever had been in place previously, does it not remain the sort of like guiding document?
Okay. Of course, yes. And for those areas that don't have a plan, we just use our municipal development plan to guide our decisions.
Great.
Okay, or their existing ARP.
Exactly. So if there is an existing ARP, we'd use that. But there are many of Calgary's communities that don't have existing ARPs.
I would also note that places like Bridgeland, they've got like a 1981 ARP that was designed around Bridgeland never ever changing. There are actually land uses on the books where it was like, this is a bakery and all it can ever be is a bakery. And, then we've also, I think Bridgeland also has the most amended ARP in the city because we built the bridges and we did everything. So that, having an ARP from 1981 that contemplates very little community change doesn't mean you're not going to get community change. It means that every single piece of change is a fight. And the whole dream of local area planning that's forward-looking is that we have the difficult conversations up front. And when it comes time to spend money, developers are coming in and spending money on the things that we've all agreed we want and that the market wants and everything, rather than fighting every little single thing. Because if you want to talk about affordability, another thing that drives up housing costs is if every single thing you build is a one-off knockdown, drag them out fight. We want to avoid that. We want to have the difficult conversations up front so that when it's go time, we can provide things as quickly and as cheaply as possible, because in development, time is money.
Yeah, that makes me wonder. The local area plans will eventually become obsolete as well, right? So just like that ARP from the 80s doesn't work now because things have changed. At what point, after we go through all the fights now, at what point we're going to be like, okay, it's been 5 years or whatever, and we need a new one. Like what's the due date?
Yeah, we
I
definitely
have
want
two
to.
answers for that, but you go,
Exactly.
Lisa. You go first, because I do.
We definitely want to make sure that we're doing local area plans for all the communities that are really in need of local area plans right now. So my guess is that once we finish a local area plan in your area, we probably wouldn't be back in it for the next 10 years or so to rethink that. We know that these plans have a shelf life, but we want to make sure that when we put a plan in place that we're sticking to it and that we're not rethinking it with every application or rethinking it, every couple of years when something big comes in. We want to make sure that those local area plans set a common expectation for what's going to be developing and what's going to go where and what's not going to go in certain places. And we want to make sure that that certainty is given and that those expectations are accommodated. So hopefully it won't be too soon before we change the plan. We want to make sure that we give it time to be successful and see how it grows and changes. We know though that planning is not static. So I just want to throw that in there. There's always changes that happen in our city, in our community, in our lives that make us question stuff, right? So even COVID, like before COVID happened, how would we have even ever thought or contemplated all the things that we do right now, given our situation? And so there's always things that are going to come up. There's always trends that are going to come up, and we do have to be proactive and responsive to those. But I also know that there's a need to give communities that certainty around what those expectations are in a local area plan.
Yeah, I'm gonna agree with a lot of what Lisa said, but also challenge it, I think, on sort of 3 levels. Number one, and I said this earlier, is that our previous planning regime was based on counting cars and stuffing cars into space, and based on the idea that neighborhoods don't change. When you build a bunch of cul-de-sacs, the buildings that are on those cul-de-sacs can't change because you can't stuff any more cars onto or off you. When you build a mixed-use neighborhood, it's designed to change. And so I think if we acknowledge that we're building a different kind of city now, and a city that's designed to change, as opposed to a city that's resisting change, then our plans actually won't necessarily stale date, much at all. If we're planning for 60 years or longer, and we allow those things to happen, and then we bring in infrastructure investments as that investment is driven and as the need requires, then these plans don't stale date. Plans stale date when you set up plans that are trying to stop changes that need to or want to happen anyway. Number two, the local area planning exercise is set up as a living process, right? It's set up to be constantly reviewed in more meaningful ways than any local area plan before. And the quicker you can put plans on the books, and the more you have a municipal bureaucracy that's working with communities to affect change and to monitor change and to guide change, then the living document thing comes in. And then my third point is that we're in the middle of a significant reorganization of the city. And that reorg is putting everybody who plans anything in the city in one department. And my mission is to see them deployed into the multi-community areas. I believe that every community should have an interdisciplinary team of civil servants working with the community to constantly guide and work on change, so that your planner is a person in the neighborhood and the parks person's a person in the neighborhood. And with 180, 200 communities in the city of Calgary, there's no way you can create those kinds of interdisciplinary teams. But with 40 multi-community districts, you absolutely can deploy 40 mixed-use teams or interdisciplinary teams into those areas. And then the competition comes down not between who gets more funding, the roads department or the parks department or the transportation department or the transit department. The competition comes down to who can make, with their community, their part of the city, the best, most livable, most exciting, part of the city. And I think that that's a healthy competition. And so those are my 3 answers to this bugaboo that plans stalemate. No, planning should be a living thing, and we're getting there, and this guide gets us there.
Yeah, I just want to jump in on one more thing too, because I know in the past, like we as administration have, finished a policy and then you don't hear from us again. And one of the things I want to stress is that the guidebook team is going to be along for the ride with the local area planning teams. So if people are worried that the guide is, set in stone, or there's no opportunity to change it, or that they're worried that, we've put in place all these policies before we've even gotten to their area for a local area plan, I really want to assure them that we're here to listen to those folks, to make those changes as needed. And I'm sure there's tons of things we're going to learn through multiple local area plan processes, because all communities are different. And we've only done one local area plan, or multi-community plan. So I really want to stress that we're along for that ride. And if things need to change, we can absolutely change them. We're open to learning new ways to engage and new ways to plan.
That's
So
a
thank
great
you for letting
point.
me.
Yeah. Not only is the local area plan a living document, but the guidebook's a living document, and it's informed by the bottom-up process of working with community. And that's the best practice, and that's what the guide unleashes on the city, which is very different from how we build the city right now and how we built the city for the last 7 decades.
Totally.
Very different in a very good way.
Yeah, we have another question here. Jordan asks, it seems from the hearing and comments here that there is a fundamental disagreement on the vision of the future Calgary, of the future Calgary that underpins the guidebook. Do you think that more time should have been taken engaging Calgarians and selling citizens on the vision first?
Yeah, I want to address this. This is a great question, Jordan. Thank you so much for putting it out there, because the guidebook isn't our visionary document for the city of Calgary. Our municipal development plan is, and that development plan was created 2009 and just recently updated and approved by council this February. And I believe Gian-Carlo mentioned it earlier, but that engagement that we did back in 2009, I think included over 60,000 people, with another 40,000 being re-engaged this year and last year to create the update. So that the guide really stems from the municipal development plan. It doesn't create new policies. It doesn't create a new vision for Calgary. It builds on the vision that's already been approved, that's already been through committee and through our stakeholders. So I want to point that out, because a lot of people have this misconception that the guide is this new radical planning document that introduces a lot of new policies, and it really doesn't. In fact, if you read the guide next to the municipal development plan, you'll see so much of that cohesion coming through. So it's not about re-debating the vision for Calgary. That was done through a different planning process. This is really about how do we take that vision and implement it, or as Gian-Carlo likes to say, operationalize it on the ground.
I do like to say that word, operationalize. Yeah, I agree with everything Lisa said. I cannot overstress how the Imagine Calgary process through the 2000s and the lead up to the 2009 passing of the municipal development plan was at the time the largest engagement of a citizenry about a city's future in the history of cities. And it won all kinds of international awards. So, the problem is, for the last 10 years, how we plan our city and what we say we want our city to be we've had a say-do gap, and this bridges that say-do gap. And if your mission is to resist change or prevent change, then by all means fight this. But if your interest is in a city that works a lot better, because Imagine Calgary was not a bunch of idiots just basically opining, it was a deep dive into what makes economic sense, what makes social sense, what makes environmental sense, and to really sort of establish a vision for this city that is a lot more sustainable, a lot more economically diversified, a lot more socially inclusive. And so if you're against those things, by all means, fight this. But if you're not, and you want us to actually see the rubber hit the road and actually achieve our goals as a people, then let's work together and approve the guide, and then make sure that the guide gets better and better through every local area plan that we do with communities.
Right, and then they can continue to engage with their own community and improve it. Here we have another question from George. He's asking if in communities like Renfrew are divided about this densification. Some people weren't aware of the ALAP, and now that they are, they don't like it. So how does that work?
Yeah, I can take a step. Or go,
No,
Gian-Carlo.
you go, Lisa. I'll jump in with the color commentary, the ranting at the end.
So as you can imagine, with 9 communities in our North Hill local area plan, not everybody is going to be engaged on the same level. But as administration, we definitely took as much as we could do feasibly and financially to inform folks. And whether or not folks decided to pay attention is really on you guys. And we do rely a lot on our community reps to have those discussions with the community. But again, it takes everybody coming out to be part of that. We did do 2 mail drops in all of North Hill and all of the community to every single address. So, you know, through those 2 mail drops, we were really hoping to get folks at least aware of it, if not, you know, informed and engaged. But yeah, we can definitely, I think there's always going to be folks that, you know, don't agree with the process, but what our job is to really do is to make sure that people understand that process, even if they don't agree to it, and make sure that they're along for that and understand that. So Jorg, if you have any suggestions about how we could make that more accessible, I think that would be great. We'd love more information about how, you know, what we could have done to make sure that you got to that point of understanding it before now.
Thanks, Lisa. Councillor.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. I'm happy to answer the next question, which is, I think, a follow-up to that.
Yes, it is. So yeah, so the city's shift to multi-community planning is so much broader than the successful Main Streets planning approach. Is there still a role for focused planning like Main Streets or
Yeah,
shopping centers?
that's a great question. And the answer is absolutely, because a local area plan is it's a big sort of allotment of broad swaths of density and growth and networks of mobility, whether it's transit or maybe it's an opportunity to build a new road. Like I know Inglewood and Ramsey lost the 8th Street connection. There's a question: do we punch an underpass under the tracks at like 9th Street? These are big questions that need to be answered. But then it comes down to really sort of specific things. And the local area plan identifies comprehensive planning sites, right? Areas where, you know, there's a big piece of land like the Inglewood Brewery or the former Midfield Home mobile site, or a Main Street corridor or something like that. And how does that work? And how does the streetscape work? The local area plan says this is an area where we need to do some thinking and we need to do some much more focused design. Let's get that done. And until those things are on the books, it will never happen. And when they are on the books and the market starts to respond, and you build the green line, and what happens around the station, and where do you put the plazas, and where are the real estate opportunities, and where are the shops, the great coffee shop that Quinn wants when he steps off the train. These are the big questions. So yeah, the local area planning exercise, which is a big picture thing, will set up a bunch of really specific urban design interventions where they need to be, whether it's a streetscape master plan or a station area plan or whatever. And on top of that, we're fighting to get funding, permanent funding, so that as these areas get identified, they will be funded for both the more detailed planning and then the actual construction. Because the other thing that this guidebook's about, and I just want to say that, is about shifting what we've done for decades, which is taking our taxes and subsidizing growth on the edge of the city, and instead taking our taxes and reinvesting it in the places that have been paying taxes.
Yeah, that's an excellent point to start with another question that's, it just moved. Yeah, like, is there any guarantee from the city that increased density will actually turn into that, like bring new or improved facilities? Will that taxpayers' money be invested in the communities where the people live instead of the suburban communities?
Well, I always say that the guide sits at the linchpin of the transformation of our planning system. And there's 4 big pieces of heavy lifting that it does. Number one, and we've talked about this, it operationalizes our vision, the municipal development plan. And it does so almost in a bottom-up reforming way. Number two, it kicks off that sort of local area planning that every community wants. They want to know what the change is coming, what they can expect, what you know, and you can have a conversation about what changes and what doesn't change. And that's what local area planning does. Number three, it creates a historic process of reinvestment in communities that have just been paying taxes and not really seeing a lot for that. Where do the main streets go? Where does the transit go? Where do the parks get built? All of those things. You identify those in a local area plan, and then you put, and then we start reinvesting. And as more people come to live in that neighborhood and more tax base comes, it's more of an incentive to respond to that with public investment.
But how do you guarantee that that's going to happen?
Well, you don't guarantee it, but
Okay.
you don't guarantee it, but this guarantees that we set up a process for that to happen. Whereas right now we have no process. And what we've done for years is we just take our taxes and we subsidize an increasingly sprawling city that makes less and less dollars and cents. So this actually sets us up to make a lot more sense in what we're doing. The final thing that the guidebook does, and this is the thing I think that twigs everybody, is the idea that the guidebook is changing the land use on a particular parcel. And right now the guidebook doesn't. The guidebook creates an urban form category that might get applied to a particular parcel through a local area planning process. But right now we have a planning system that's insane, because we have a vision that talks about one thing, and then we have a land use bylaw that talks about something else. We have what we'd like our city to become and what we allow our city to become. And in 2009, when we established our vision for what we wanted our city to become, 2 years before that, we had passed a land use bylaw that was very much a backwards looking risk management exercise that said what's on the ground is what's allowed to happen. And so those two things have been the result of so many community fights, because we want our city to become something, but we allow our city to become something else. And what the guidebook does is it creates an environment, it creates a planning process where for the first time in the city's history, what we want our city to become and what we allow our city to become could become almost the same thing. But that won't and can't happen until we pass the guide, we start doing local area planning, and then we took a look at reforming our land use bylaw to something that actually works with our aspirations. So those are the 4 transformations. And is anything guaranteed? Absolutely not, especially when, you know, 1 billion old white people show up and say, I don't want my neighborhood to change, and freak council out.
Ximena, can I jump in for 1 second on that?
Go ahead.
I agree. Nothing's guaranteed, but the guidebook sets up the process for having those discussions at the local area plan stage, whether it's a rec center or a pool or a new bridge that community would need. The local area plan has a process for that discussion to happen so that all stakeholders understand what it means to have those amenities come into the community in terms of what density is needed to support it, what type of private investment is needed to support it, etc. So while there's no guarantee, that process though does inform our budgets and business plans and will be part of that basis that we use to make that pitch to council, you know, every budget process to say, here's where we did planning and here's where we're seeing that growth. And so here's where we need to invest. And we're hoping that that brings that alignment really together to be able to say, you know, here's what we've identified in the local area plan as needed, and here's how we get there. And so hopefully that gap will start to be bridged.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks.
Right. It's a way better process than we currently have.
Yeah, I have a question that's kind of like unrelated, but I remember that I really wanted to ask this. And it's, so now that the guide is no longer statutory, what does it mean? Like, will communities doing the local area plan, like, do they have to, like, are they obligated? Like, are they bound by anything?
So making the guide non-statutory means it's more of a process related question. It means that we're adopting it by resolution rather than by bylaw. And what that means is it's just a more informal way of council to approve a policy, but it's still a council approved policy, which means as administration, we still use it and we still look at it. So it does offer a bit more flexibility to the communities going through a local area plan to really look at the policies of the guide and see which ones are appropriate for that specific community. But we still want to make sure that the guide is a source of, of consistent policy, so that when that local area plan takes those policies, they're doing it in a way that still maintains that consistency throughout. So it's not about redebating those policies, but it's about having that local area and the communities in there looking at the guide to determine which policies are most appropriate for them. And what we heard through our engagement was that people were worried that if this became a statutory document, it would be set in stone. We as administration would walk away and thou shalt forever use this guide to plan your communities. And I really took that to heart. Me and my team really sat down and thought about, how do we give communities these assurances that we're not just walking away, that we're not setting something in stone. And part of that is by being able to approve it as non-stat. And so if that helps give that security or give that assurance or flexibility to communities, we're all for it.
Yeah, the thing where the rubber hits the road is the local area plan.
Mm-hmm.
So, that will be a statutory document. And ideally, if we're, successful in getting everyone on the same page, the local area plan and the land use will come together in the future. That's not for sure going to happen, but that's my dream. The guidebook not being statutory is, as Lisa said, very charitably, it is out of respect for people saying, well, if this isn't going to change my community, why is it a law? It's like, okay, it's not a law. It's just a guide to guide you in creating the law, which is the local area plan. And then we have a whole nother law, the land use bylaw, which is just sitting out there. And it would be nice if those things live together and work together rather than fought at each other all the time. I want to note that Paul Ferry, local pundit from the University of Calgary, said the most hilarious thing on Twitter about the whole guidebook situation. And he said, I want a Netflix series where the season finale hinges on the idea that a document that should have been statutory became non-statutory. And it's like hilariously inside baseball. It doesn't really matter. And if it's more respectful to people who are freaking out, by all means, we'll make it non-statutory.
Thanks, Councillor. Here we have another question from Helen Gitersus. I probably butchered that, but I'm sorry. So here it is. Given Lisa's comments, which to her seemed to suggest that the size of the North Hill area made it impossible to engage community members on a one-on-one basis, are there plans to have a similar Facebook Live on the North Hill area plan? Lisa said she wanted suggestions on how to make engagement more robust. You could start by doing that, she says.
Yeah, it's definitely something we can look into, and I can bring that feedback back to the team that's doing the local area plan. I do want to say, planning is a two-way street, right? It's not just about us coming and making sure everybody has the information. Everybody has different levels of interest, and we also have a limited budget that we can use to make sure that folks are informed. So I do really want to stress that when you see those billboards in your community, make sure you're looking at that and make sure you're paying attention to your community newsletters, because we have put ads in those letters. We've done the mail out twice. We've put up the billboards, and while I don't disagree, there's different ways to do it. And I think this is a great example. And if this is something that would help you guys, I'm totally open to doing more of them. I think it's just, we have to be cognizant that it is that two-way street.
Yeah, I just want to point out that, maybe 200 people signed up for this, 200 people plus. I don't know how many people are currently watching. That's a drop in the bucket of the, hundreds of thousands of people who live inside the North Hill, planning area. And how do you reach people? I wish I knew. I wish there was some way to deeply inform everybody of everything that's going on. And at the end of the day, we have a representative government where, we're supposed to trust the people we elect, to our community boards, to our business association. I believe that we can do the local area planning engagement more robustly. I believe the idea of having interdisciplinary teams who are people in the neighborhood are fundamental to that. I believe fundamentally in feedback loops, rather than going in and seeing a bunch of boards and sort of talking to individual people, something that's more educational, something that's more interactive, and then something that shows how what you said was considered and either used to change the plan or not in a much more expansive way is important. It's also important to have those curated groups of citizens to have much more deep dive conversations, but we're not quite where we need to be on the local area planning engagement yet. But at the same time, at the end of the day, it's not like any decision in the North Hill plan was made for poor reasons, or that your neighbors who spent dozens and dozens and dozens of hours having deep dive conversations about these issues made capricious or stupid or unthoughtful decisions. They made very thoughtful decisions. There has to be a little bit of trust, and there has to be a little bit of impetus on the individual citizens' part to either get more engaged and have opportunities to do so, or to have a little bit more faith in your neighbors who are stepping up and rolling up their sleeves and doing the work.
Yeah, that faith part is kind of tricky. And that's one thing that I would like to ask you, like how do you ensure that a diversity, a representative diversity of people are getting involved? Because let's be honest, there's some people who are more likely to get involved, and they might not represent the demographic makeup of a community or a bunch of communities that make up a local area plan.
Do you want to take this, Lisa, or do you want me to take it?
You go for it.
All right. Well, I will say that there are an emerging number of academic studies that show that the people who show up to local planning processes are more concerned or more afraid of change, and have more of the wherewithal to spend the time doing that. And so oftentimes we're planning reactively on behalf of an overrepresented group of people. And what happened with the guidebook when like a huge number of people from Elbow Park came out because they were afraid about Elbow Park is a classic example of this in our own city. So I think what you need to do is you need to have a variety of different engagement processes. And I see Quinn's turned on his camera, so I'll turn it over to him. I'll say that we can do local area planning better, but the idea of having curated citizen groups that represent the diversity of the community, do the deep dives, is an important part of the process, not the only part of the process. Quinn, over to you.
Yeah, I think part of it too is making sure that we have, like, the way that the engagement was structured for a lot of these pilot local area plans was trying to have something for everyone, right? So like if you were very hyper engaged, you care a lot about planning, there's something for you. If you are like somewhat engaged and you want to give a bit of time to do a survey or come to an open house, there's something for you. If you want to get the information, there's something for you. If you want to ignore all of it, you fill your boots. But to sort of your question, Ximena, I think like one of the things that we want to do better here is that we need to look within the local area plan to see, what are the points at which we can best involve some of these underrepresented communities, and how can we create engagement opportunities that go to them, that are respectful of systemic barriers, things like time, things like childcare, things like access to technology. How can we create those structures to allow for better engagement? And how can we make sure that the kind of engagement that we undertake through those activities is meaningful and goes into a meaningful change or informs a meaningful structure in the documents? So again, like, it's something that we've been working on a lot over a number of years now through our inclusive engagement practices. And I think that it's something we want to improve on through our local area planning process as well.
Quinn, you just hit on the key though. Like, to get diversity of that is really about access, right? It's making this process more accessible, and not just this process, because one of the things over the past month that I've really learned is this process that we're in right now is focused on the guide, right? It's focused on a project or an outcome or a deliverable. But I think there's a real opportunity for the city to make a difference in terms of going out and talking about planning absent of a project or absent of a deliverable, because there's always this thought of, well, the city's doing it so that, they can get this guy across the finish line. But I really want to be able to have more of that discussion with communities and with stakeholders about all planning topics, so that they have more access to that information, because asking people to just jump right into a planning process and become that expert is really unfair of us to expect of the average everyday person who maybe isn't a planning nerd. Right?
Yeah.
So having more of that and doing more of that is so important as we move forward. And Quinn hit it on the head. It's about access to that information, and we need to do a better job at providing that.
And I want to jump in there and just say, one of the challenges, I agree with everything you've said, but one of the challenges that arises is that people are over engaged, right? Like, there's just too many things going on. And then the idea that you're going to have sort of like a book club relationship with the city to talk about planning, abstract of all the change that's already happening in your neighborhood, could be a lot. And access is not just about ability to access, it's also time to access. So, the two things that I think, on top of everything that you said that I agree with, is number one, feedback loops. People have to be able to see how the changes, how the input has changed the plan, and be carried along on that process. And that's really critical. And then number two, I get back to the idea of that multi-community plan being sort of a governance structure and a organization structure for the city and how it interfaces with its citizenry. And I think that if we have, next generation community associations that are managing those areas, and there are interdisciplinary teams of citizens who are working with them, then government sort of comes down a level and is much closer to home, and is much more, then the idea of the book club and the process, and knowing that becomes a lot easier to do. And so that's my mission through Great Neighborhoods, is not just to drive the planning, but the citizen representation and the administrative support to local areas, into this complementary level of support.
Yeah, thanks. Shift makes a very good question here, of like, why can't we make this engagement ongoing? So it becomes like communities are familiar with it and they don't feel like it's threatening, and they know it. And I think it would be also useful for planners to get more acquainted. Go ahead, Quinn.
Yeah. So one thing that's kind of new that we are hoping to pilot in a couple of our local area plan areas, our local area. I don't know the right way to say this. I'm sorry, but like one of the things that we've launched is what's called a planning liaison. So what it is a planner who is assigned to a local area plan area, who would ideally go out in advance of us getting going with that process, to start building those relationships with community associations, like service providers, other community groups, that kind of thing, to start building that base of understanding, building that base of connections, so that when we do get going, we have a good foundation from which to build the local area planning process. What it also offers, though, is like someone within the planning department who can, direct people to the right project that might be ongoing, causing some concern, or maybe explain or connect people with a different business unit within the organization that might, be the one, instead of planning, who's taking care of something of interest to the community. So it's a need that we definitely saw, and something that we'd like to roll out. The sort of like speed and extent to which it'll be rolled out, I don't honestly know, but yeah, I share it's a great idea.
I think it'll be attached to the reorg. that is underway, and I think it's going to land along the lines of what I'm talking about, and I think it'll be a very good thing. Sorry, Lisa, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think what Quinn is getting at is that relationship building, right? We need a different way to build those relationships. And I mean, that for me is at the heart of planning. It's why I became a planner, is because I want those relationships with folks to continuously build and get that feedback, so that, you know, whether you're engaging on a streetscape project or a new sewer line or a local area plan, you start to see those connections, and you have somebody that you have that relationship with that can start to come in and put those dots together, so that every new engagement isn't about engagement fatigue, right? Because it isn't about starting from scratch and trying to learn everything about one thing. It's about having that continual process that goes along. And I think for me, I know that sounds cheesy, but it is definitely one of the bigger things for me that Quinn mentioned.
The only caveat I want to add to that is that the change that needs to occur is that our current planning system is based on the idea that change is bad or is going to wreck your community, and the city's job as a planning approval department is to try and minimize the damage that change is going to do. And I think our entire land use bylaw and everything set up around that. I mean, I'd even push to you, Ximena, earlier in the conversation. You were like, "Well, my neighborhood's changing. Why does it have to change and Elbow Park doesn't get to change?" And we have to flip the script and just say change is good and welcome, and it's how we become more inclusive. It's how we become more thriving. It's how we become more resilient. And our job is to work together to drive the change that makes sense. And if we get over change as being bad and start working together with all of those relationships and the cities at the table and the local communities and all their diversity are at the table and the planning systems organized together around that, I think we've got a good world coming.
I love Quinn's
and I just wanted to, Quinn gets a rant, yay. One of the things that really jumped out at me during the public hearing of council on the guidebook, as well as the engagement that we did through April, which really, like, we were there to listen, right? So I did a lot of listening and not a lot of planning. But one of the things that jumped out to me as I was listening to this is that yeah, like we need to do this engagement in a way that like builds understanding and that builds capacity and then moves to discuss change from that place. And personally, like I've worked on many portfolios from an engagement standpoint since I joined the city 5 years ago, from sewer lines on 17th Avenue to, you know, overpasses to all sorts of stuff. And I made a very clear and conscious request of the leadership in my team to be able to work with planning, because I felt very excited about the local area planning process and the way that engagement was envisioned to take place through that. And, you know, with all the caveats that I said before, in terms of like, this is an ongoing process and one where we want to build and improve, what I found really inspiring about it from an engagement standpoint professionally is that that's really what it seeks to do, right? Like it seeks to start a conversation around what people love about their community and the areas that they love about their community, and then to be iterative and purposeful in how you build that from sort of like this underlying vision to what a future development could be. And like I forget. And yeah, exactly. And I forget who said it earlier in the conversation tonight, but somebody talked about this idea of faith and having some like having like a little bit of trust in this process. And I think that would be the one sort of ask, if I could put that out to people who are part of this tonight, is like, I know all processes are fraught in one way or another, but I think that this is one that has a lot of potential, and I really believe will grow into something great in terms of how the city does planning and does planning of communities. And so, you know, don't maybe have some trust that it won't be all terrible, that this could be like a really great way for us to build communities together.
Yeah, totally. Let's move on to the next question. Catherine Walker Parsons is asking, given the fact that the 62 guidebook amendments were not available in the North Hill LAP, how will this be addressed? Will there be additional opportunities for engagement or or to review the LAP with these new amendments?
Yeah, that is a great question. Thank you for bringing that up. So most of the amendments that we're proposing through the 62 changes actually already show up through North Hill, and many of the technical changes that we've made, like the grammatical stuff or, like slight wording changes to make sure that we're responsive and using our language correctly, that stuff will already appear in the North Hill Guide. We're already updating some of that right now to bring it over. There's two things though that are kind of outstanding. So one is about the heritage guidelines, and the second one is about the single detached special policy area. So despite the fact that North Hill will come back to council in June with some of those things embedded, those are two things that we will have like placeholder spots for them in the North Hill local area plan, where once those heritage guidelines and those heritage tools are finalized, we can come back and put them into the North Hill local area plan. As well, we can have that conversation about the single detached special policy area. And right now we'll kind of put a placeholder in the North Hill Communities Plan to acknowledge that those are tools that haven't been used yet, but that we need to follow up on. So absolutely, it would be something that we would come back with fairly quickly once North Hill gets approved, to talk about with the communities as well.
I want to note that another change that's coming with North Hill is that we have the up to 6 stories as being the baseline in a lot of corridors, and people were suggesting that was too high. Administration has come back and said, you know what, we're comfortable with an up to 4 stories multifamily height, which is not to say that there won't be the occasional one that goes up to 6 stories, but that'll be a more thoughtful one-off conversation. I was mixed about that, because up to 6 stories doesn't mean that everything becomes 6 stories, and it certainly doesn't mean it happens quickly. And I always point to Inglewood. 9th Avenue in Inglewood was given a 20-meter height in the 1960s, and it was not a thoughtful understanding of how wide the street should be to building walls. It was just basically the entire neighborhood was going to be destroyed. Everything that was left was given a 60-meter height in a commercial zoning. And it literally took like 50 years for that 20-meter height to get met by a single new project. And, at the end of the day, up to 6 meters means that you create a plan that can live for a long time and respond to many things, and it's sort of thoughtfully put in. But now it's up to 4 stories, and that applies to places in Crescent Heights and some of the corridors in Renfrew. And, the point is, these plans are living, they're responding.
You bring up a really good point though, Gian-Carlo, is that, a lot of people have this worry that we're jumping in the guide from 3 stories to 6 stories to 12 stories and that there's nothing in between. But the guide actually lets local area plans create those nuances where it's appropriate. And I want to point that out because it isn't just about, you get 5 scales and that's it. Scale is really intended to look at how buildings are designed, not so much about height, because height is dealt with in the land use bylaw. So I do want to mention that, if you have those concerns about, where you're seeing something about 6 stories, have that discussion through the local area plan process, because that's where we're going to have those discussions about, where is the height appropriate and where is it maybe not appropriate. And the local area plan can absolutely have those customizations.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. I had a question I was going to ask, but I lost it, and I have another one now. This question is from Sarah. She's asking, do you think the average Calgarian knows the LAP is not just their own community making decisions, but multiple communities who have to agree on how their collective LAP is developed?
So this is a new process that we're going through, right? So North Hill is the first local area plan that we've done with multi-communities, but we are going through the process right now in the heritage communities, which is right around the Heritage LRT station, as well as the Westbrook communities, similarly around the Westbrook Mall and the Westbrook LRT station as well. And both of those, what we've learned through that is it isn't about, you know, one community saying, okay, this other community can get all the density because I want to stay the same. And it's not about this kind of trade-off. It's about having that discussion with your neighbors about, you know, where that growth happens or where that change happens. And it's not this fight or this battle between like you get that or I get this. It's about the collective good, about saying, you know, how do we benefit from each other and where do we go? And I know this sounds cheesy, but I would really strongly encourage everybody to think about your daily journeys, to think about that, you know, your life and your patterns and where you go and what you do. I think you would be, you know, hard pressed to find that you just stay in your one localized community. I think everybody enjoys going around to their boundaries. Like I know I live near Fish Creek. My community's not right on Fish Creek, but I go to Fish Creek and I go through those communities all the time just to get there. So thinking about your daily patterns and that journey will help when thinking about what should go where and why. And so I do want to stress, it's not about one community saying, okay, that community gets it all or that community gets nothing. It's about having that informed discussion about what makes sense where.
Yeah, what, you know, I think, and I'll ask Sarah, you know, how much of what you're asking is informed from the base understanding or the inherent assumption that change is bad? And change is not bad. It's not a question of yes or no. It's a question, as Lisa says, of where and how. And you want to engage in very thoughtful conversations with your neighbors about how to work together and how to build the best possible set of relationships with each other. One of the theories of growth and change in cities that I've always thought about is that the first thing a community does is it talks about who it is. But that's just the first thing. The more important conversation, once you've understood who you are and why you are, is what your relationship with everyone else is. And that's another thing that I have been pushing the guide to envelop, and I'm gonna work to see embedded in other local area plans, is that our current conception of communities are oftentimes multiple historic communities. We know Renfrew was a bunch of historic communities. Bridgeland, Riverside retains that. Winston Heights, Mount View. There was also Balmoral and Tuxedo Park. Inglewood was Inglewood, Pierce Estates, Walker Estates, East Calgary, and Brewery Flats. And the question is, what's the relationship between those finer grain pieces, and then the relationship between Inglewood and Ramsey, and then the relationship between all of historic East Calgary? This is about not just what you are, it's also about your relationship with others. And a healthy planning process appreciates what individual communities and neighborhoods are, and then what the relationship is between all of them, and then eventually what the relationship with the whole city is, with big pieces like the Green Line.
Totally.
Yeah, I think this will probably be the last question from the audience. When the guidebook and local area redevelopment plan and local area plans are in place, will this change the approvals process for new developments?
That's a great question. So the guide and the local area plan themselves do not change the planning process. The process is something that we'd have to look at internally, and it also has a lot to do with the land use bylaw. And so, like Gian-Carlo had mentioned earlier, our existing land use bylaw was formulated based on what was on the ground. It wasn't a policy exercise, it was just purely a regulation exercise. And so we need to think about what our bylaw says and how we move that forward. And so some processes, I think, have the opportunity to be changed, while other processes probably don't need to change. But I think one of the key things for me is that all of that work has to be done in conjunction with communities and stakeholders. We can't make that decision on our own. We need to know what's important to you folks, to really think about, okay, do we have the right processes in place? And this is kind of what I was getting at earlier by this whole idea of like engaging for the sake of knowledge, and just not on a project, but just engaging. Because, you know, part of what we try to do is, I don't want to have a project that just says, let's make our processes easier or let's make them quicker, because that shouldn't be our goal. Our goal should be great communities, and our goal should be a community where everybody feels their voice is heard and they're represented. So let's figure out the processes to get to that. And it might mean we have an easier process. It might mean we have a much more discretionary process where we look at a lot more things. It really depends on what we're talking about. I do think, though, that one of the things that is my goal with the whole new planning system is the expectations. So whether the process changes or whether our policies or regulations change, that people understand that expectation of what is going to happen and where and how, and so that we can all work from that common foundation.
I agree with a lot of what Lisa said. I'm gonna say a couple of extra things though. And number one is that one of the biggest time sucks of the entire organization of the city of Calgary is around marching individual proposals for individual parcels through a long process to get things built. And that takes a lot of money, and it takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of expertise, and it drives the cost of housing and doing business and all of those things up and up and up. And it's based on the idea that change is going to wreck your community, and we have to put all of these belts and braces in place to prevent your community from getting wrecked, or at the very least mitigate the damage as much as we can. If we shift to an idea that neighborhood change is inevitable and welcome, and we really want to drive the change that makes the most sense for the most of us, that is really what should inform the local area planning process. And in an ideal system, not only does everyone agree at the end of long, difficult conversations up front what their community should become, but then we put the rules in place so that the community is allowed to become that. So when it comes time to actually build something, things accelerate. And something I always tell, something I hear from communities sometimes is that we shouldn't make any decisions about land use until we have a local area plan in place. And what I tell them is that ideally a local area plan will prevent an overwhelming majority of the fights we're having, because we all agree up front as to what should happen. There's always going to be someone who comes along and says, you know, I'm allowed to do this on this piece of property, but I want to do that. And we cannot tell them, well, you're not allowed to do that because the plan says you have to do this. What we can say is the plan says this for these reasons. What are your reasons? And then we have a reason off. And at the end of the day, someone makes the decision, it's council, about who had the best set of reasons and what should move forward. A great local area planning process will get everyone on the same page about hopefully 90–95% of those. So when you actually go through a land use process and you arrive at city council, it's a remarkable and unique circumstance, and people have to do the work because the majority of change is already collaboratively decided upon by everyone, and it moves a lot faster and smoother, and the world is more environmentally friendly and more affordable and more opportunistic, and there's more opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. So as a way of closing remarks, I would like to ask you one last question and tell our audience tonight why you think that these amendments should be approved on May 5th. Lisa, you go first.
Thank you. I guess what I would say to folks is just a big thank you. We've learned so much over the past month and over the past 3 years and over the past 15 years that I've been at the city. And I really thank you guys for giving us that information. I think the guide really should be approved because if we want to build a Calgary of the future, we need a starting point. And this is that foundation. It builds off of the existing municipal development plan. And I think, you know, there's a lot of things that come together. It's not just about planning, but it's about costs and making sure that our city is environmentally, economically, and socially sustainable moving forward. And I genuinely don't know how to do that without something like the guide. So, you know, if we're serious about moving forward and making sure that Calgary is an attractive place, not just for talent, but for the existing folks who live here, we need to make sure that we're being equitable and diverse. And this is, you know, the first baby step in that process.
Yeah, I would maybe quibble that it's not a baby step. It's a pretty significant step. And I think
there's so much more to do.
It's a good step, and it sets a lot of things in motion. We've talked about a lot of those things. I would say that some people are characterizing the changes that have been made since the last public hearing to the guidebook as some sort of compromise or some kind of fallback, and it's not. It is a commitment that planning is an engaged and engaging and living thing, and the dream that we're trying to create is a lot more certainty with a lot more flexibility. It's like the perfect pizza crust, which has to be crunchy and chewy at the same time. How do those two things live together? The best planning systems involve certainty and flexibility at the same time within a framework that everyone understands. And so I'm happy to move this forward. I hope that the politics of fear, anger, and division, I hope that misinformation has not undermined council's ability to stand strong with what is an incredible piece of work by our administration to finally, after 11 years, operationalize our municipal development plan. I do not see the changes that have been made as anything other than a very clear commitment to be as responsive and as engaged and engaging with our citizens as the whole system's attempting to become. So I'm happy to support these changes. They make sense. They refine, they clarify, and they listen to people, and they do not move us off the transformation that we're on, and they do not prevent us from a system in the future that is very certain and yet very flexible.
Just no more pizza references.
I've got like several. Are you starving, Lisa? Is that the problem?
That was actually going to be my first point on my closing, is like, approve this so we never have to hear the guide referred to through a food metaphor ever again. But I think for me, like, having listened to the public hearing, having sat through our like 21 hours of workshops or whatever it was, that the calls to just like jettison the guidebook entirely were relatively few in number, and I think like there were a lot of concerns around the things that led to these amendments, and I think it's a sign that the city was listening earnestly, that they have been pulled into action in some way. I also think like there were many calls to have further discussion, and I would say that just in thinking about that through the lens of what I do at the city, the guide is part of it's part of a big sort of continuum of planning policy, and I think there's room for a conversation to like grow from a lot of the interest that has come into the guide and brought it to its current form, to grow literacy through the city around what planning policy is, to grow interest and engagement in future policy change that we do to help grow and build on that planning continuum. And so like that, I mean, that to me is why I'd like to see this go ahead, is it takes us into the next step of this broader conversation with Calgarians about how we form this sort of next stage of planning policy in the city, which is cool to me, who is like tangentially involved in being a planning nerd. So that is my 2 cents.
Oh, you're already one, Quinn. We've converted you.
Yeah, I'm in it now, whether I like it or not.
One of us.
Yeah, I want to thank everyone, Quinn, Lisa, Councillor Carra, and all the people who made it these 2 hours listening to us. I hope you learned and you got a lot of your questions solved. If not, you can always go to the city's website. There's an FAQ section where I'm pretty sure if there's anything left, you can probably find an answer there. And I think if there is one main takeaway from this, is that change will happen. So it will either happen with us or without us. So get engaged, do whatever you can, even if it's a little bit. And if you don't understand what they're talking about, ask them and annoy them. I think that's key. Don't feel bad because you don't know what an ARP is, or
No.
what's the difference with an LAP. You go and you ask and get engaged, and that's my closing remark. And thanks everyone. Have a great night.
Thanks, Ximena, for all your great facilitation too.
Thanks for trying to herd this herd of cats here.
Yes.
Awesome.